Hello. Let's talk briefly on the history of South India. This is just an overview so that we can place things in context when you read something up in detail. So let's look at prehistory, Paleolithic, Stone Age. Excavations done at Attirambakam have yielded stone tools, and they were dated around 170 to 1000 years old. Probably not Homo sapiens, but hominins that used them. And then we have evidence for Mesolithic or the Middle Stone Age until 2500 BC, where microlithic production, which is a significant part of the Middle Stone Age, where small stone mules were being used, and we have evidence for that from 6000 BC in South India. Neolithic or the New Stone Age, we have evidence for that from 2500 to 1000 BC, after which, of course, was the Iron Age, and typically megalithic burials are found all over South India, indicative of Iron Age development. And then, of course, this was followed by the Sangam period, which is usually dated around 300 BCE to 300 CE. Excavations in Aragangulam, Arikamedu, Korkai, and Pattanam, which probably was Muziris, show evidence that there was an active trade with the Romans. So Sangam between 300 BCE to 300 CE. Okay, that's not boring. Yeah, so this is just showing the popular kingdoms of the Sangam period. We have the Cheras and the Pandyas and the Cholas. The Pandyas at that time probably had their capital at Korkai, and they were a coastal kingdom, and hence perhaps fish was the symbol. Cholas had tiger as the symbol, with the capital at Urayur, and Cheras, of course, occupying the area of what is now Kerala, and they had important coastal towns which were trading, like the Muziris as well. Here's another map showing the kingdoms of Chola, Pandya, and Chera, and of course there were smaller kingdoms like the Ai kingdom and the Kotanadu kingdoms, Kongunadu kingdoms, etc., along with the main players. And this is just the relationship with the rest of the India at that time. Originally, it was the Mauryas, who were the northern neighbors of Cheras, Cholas, and the Pandyas. Especially King Ashoka, in his rock edicts, did mention about these kingdoms. After the Mauryas, of course, there were the Satavahanas, which were neighboring them in the north. This is really a fascinating map at that time, showing how extensively the Sangam South Indian kings were trading across the world. You can see the coastal routes predominantly across the Arabian Sea, trading in Ethiopia, Somalia, Arabia, all the way to Egypt, and their goods found place in Rome as well, and even towards Southeast Asia and all the way up to China. Of course, from these points, the trade goods also traveled along the Silk routes, finding their place in different areas of this part of the world. Interestingly, the Romans at that time apparently had a lot of craving for Indian goods. They loved the pearls, and they loved the spices and the cloth, and they spent a lot of gold on products from India, as a result of which a lot of gold Roman coins, as you see here, have been excavated at various points in South India. Pearls from Korkai were really fascinated by people in Rome and Egypt, and apparently Cleopatra too had a fascination for those pearls and said to have worn them quite fondly. Um, of course, I'm not sure if you can see that. The different ports in this map, right from Kovalam, Mamallapuram, Arikamedu, Nagapatnam, these are all along the coast, all the way coming to Korkai and, of course, Muziris on the western coast towards Kerala. So they were, by the looks of it, very cosmopolitan. You would probably bump into a lot more foreigners in South India at that time than you probably do now. Of course, after the Sangam period, the period between 300 CE and 600 CE is described as a dark period, and where South India was overrun by the Kalabras. It's known as the dark period because very little is known about these Kalabras. There are various theories. One of the such theory is that they are a tribe that came down from Karnataka to capture South India, and they were probably Jains. And there's another theory that says that the kings that who came after really wanted to whitewash or blackwash their contribution so much so that hardly anything is known about them. What we do know is the great epics of Silapadigaram and Manimegalai were written during that period, which probably means that they were not so uncouth and dark after all. Perhaps they belong to a different religion from those of the successors, that they felt the need to eliminate any contribution of these guys. But the fact of the matter is, very little is known about them. Because after the Kalabras, between the 6th and the 9th century, the main players in South India were the Chalukyas, the Pallavas, and the Pandyas. The Chalukyas were occupying mostly what is Karnataka today. Of course, Pandyas and Pallavas were occupying Tamil Nadu and a bit of Andhra, respectively. Of course, all these kingdoms and kings were constantly fighting with each other, vying for dominance of South India. And in spite of that, of course, they managed to build some fantastic monuments of the time. Of course, it was during the Chalukya period. These temples at Aihole, Badami, and the Pattadakal were built. And of course, the Pallavas were perhaps the first kings to build a freestanding temple at Mahabalipuram. And of course, they developed on these temples at Kanchipuram. And this is, of course, the example of the Shore Temple and the Kailasanathar Temple at Kanchipuram. And Pandyas too showed great evidence of temple building. And this is a small temple at Karugumalai in Kanyakumari district. Down at the bottom, this is an example of a temple that is cut from a rocky hill, which is a single rock, which is cut from top to bottom, to show it as a freestanding temple. Much about this later. And of course, along with these three kingdoms, there were the Rashtrakutas who came from the north and occupied all these kingdoms briefly. And one such king of Rashtrakuta was Krishna, and he is credited to have built this fantastic temple called the Kailasanathar Temple at Ellora. And this is fantastic because it is cut down again from top to bottom of a single rocky hill. And this photo, of course, doesn't do much justice to it, but if you see these small specks at the right corner, there are 2 or 3 people standing there, and you will get a sense of the scale of this temple. And interestingly, people think that the artisans who built that small rock temple of Karugumalai probably contributed to the building of this temple, and perhaps the same artisans built the temples of Kanchipuram and Mahabalipuram And when the Chalukyas attacked the Pallava kingdom, they took these artisans who built the excuse me, who built the Virupaksha temple, and then these artisans were taken over by the Rashtrakuta king to Ellora, and used them to build this temple. So there's interesting transference of skills when each kingdom invaded the other. So following these three kingdoms, of course, it was the rise of the Cholas and the Chalukyas from 800 to 1200 CE. You should remember that after the Sangams, this is the first time the Cholas are making an appearance. And of course, there is a small clan in Andhra called Renati Cholas who do claim their ancestry to the Karigala Chola of the Sangam period. And of course, the Cholas of this time gradually replaced the Pandyas and started expanding their kingdom. And of course, their neighbors were the Chalukyas, and who divided themselves into the Western Chalukyas and the Eastern Chalukyas. Because the Cholas were friendly with the Eastern Chalukyas because they had marital alliances with them, and together they fought against the Western Chalukyas and vice versa. This is perhaps the extent of kingdom of the great Rajaraja Cholan, who built the Brihadiswara temple. The photo of the Brihadiswara temple. The left and the right bottom are frescoes, example of frescoes found in Brihadiswara temple. The top one is the beautiful temple at Gangaikonda Cholapuram, built by Rajendra Chola, who followed Rajaraja Chola. Rajendra Chola was a true empire builder. He was perhaps the first king in India who went overseas and established colonies in Southeast Asia, again helping in transference of culture, trade, and other things. Of course, the Pallavas too had connections with Southeast Asia, but not in the same sense and scale as Rajendra Chola. Of course, after the Cholas and the Chalukyas, from 1200 to 1300 BC, we have the Pandyas, the Hoysalas, and the Kakatiyas and other kingdoms battling it out. This is a map showing that period of Pandyas and Hoysalas. Of course, there were the Kakatiyas who were occupying what is now Andhra Pradesh, but the imposing neighbor in the north is the Delhi Sultanate, and it was during this time that Alauddin Khilji sent his general Malik Kafur, who came all the way down to Madurai, conquering all these kingdoms, and he established a governor at Madurai and went back. And of course, after 40, very soon this governor declared himself independence, and there existed a Madurai Sultanate, believe it or not, for 40 years. So, interesting period, interesting architecture during this period. The middle one is, of course, the Hoysala architecture. The middle two are at Halibedu, Belur and Halibedu. The top one is the Daulatabad fort on top of a hill near Daulatabad. This was originally occupied by Alauddin Khilji, and subsequently Muhammad bin Tughlaq, as we have read in the history, made this his capital because he was so impressed by the view from the top that he could, easily see his enemies approach for miles. Hence, he decided that this would be the best place for him to have his capital rather than Delhi, to keep an eye on his kingdom. But of course, we all know how it proved to be a failure. Of course, the bottom picture is the Meenakshi temple, which was started to be built during the time of the Pandyas. Following that, we have in the 300s, we have the Bahmani and the Vijayanagar kingdoms. This map shows the Bahmani kingdom and the Vijayanagar kingdom to the south. Of course, there are always conflicts between the two. Interesting architecture of the Vijayanagar kingdom is seen in Hampi, what is now known as Hampi, what used to be known as Vijayanagar kingdom. And of course, from 1400s, the Bahmani kingdom, the north of Vijayanagar Empire, broke down into respective kingdoms when their governors rebelled. So you had the sultanates of Ahmednagar, Golconda, Bijapur, and Bidar, and Vijayanagar Empire was continuing. And of course, there was constant conflict between the Vijayanagar Empire and these sultanates. Of course, the important man of the Vijayanagar kingdom was Krishnadevaraya, and after Krishnadevaraya, the important man was his son-in-law, who was Ramaraya, and he had to contend with these warring states to his north. He skillfully played one against the other. He would ally with one sultan and attack the other, and he kept this up for quite some time till, of course, all of them united against him through marital alliance, and that fateful battle at Talikota happened, and after which Vijayanagar was run down by the armies, and of course the kings of Vijayanagar Empire had to flee. Subsequently, they held court at Chandragiri near Tirupati, and thus started the disintegration of Vijayanagar Empire. So these are some of the examples of architecture and during these Deccan sultanates. One is the Gol Gumbaz. Interestingly, when Gol Gumbaz were built, it was the second largest in the world to have the size of this dome. And of course, this is a fort of Golconda on the right. This is just a picture of how the Vijayanagar kingdom was divided during Krishnadevaraya's times, and all these governorships were given to Nayaks who were helping in the administration of the empire. But when the Vijayanagar kingdom broke down, all these Nayaks claimed independence. Of course, this is the fort of Chandragiri near Tirupati, from which the last Vijayanagar king was trying to have a semblance of control over his Nayaks. And then, of course, from 1500s, the Europeans started to come in for trade. We had the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the English. The Portuguese established a colony called San Tome first, and which is what became San Tome. And of course, later on, an English surgeon and a prospector who was sailing along the Coromandel coast discovered a strip of land which was sold to him by the Raja of Chandragiri through a Nayak, and that strip of land was the first trading post where an English factory was built, and subsequently became Fort St. George, and then developed into a city of what we now know as Madras. And that was the part 1 of History of South India. Part 2 will follow later. And thank you for your attention. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.